Chapter 1. Karoline Deaton glanced at her gas gauge for the 5th time since leaving Black Aces. She'd thought about getting gas there, but she'd been sure she could make it to Cauldron Valley without the stop. And then Judy started sputtering. Ugh. She pumped the gas a couple of times, praying the fumes would get her to her destination, but the car quit, and she carefully eased it to the side of the road. Dang it. What is wrong with me? It was the second time she'd run out of gas on her trip. She was trying her best to be frugal and wait for better prices on gas, but it wasn't working like she'd hoped. Putting the car in park, she glanced at her phone, which she'd forgotten to plug in. Dead. So here she was with a dead car, a dead phone, and who knew how many miles before she reached Cauldron Valley. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against the top of the steering wheel, feeling utterly defeated. Only she could be scatterbrained enough to let her car run out of gas and her phone die at the same time. Karoline thought about getting out of the car for a moment, but what would she do if she did? There was nothing there but cattle and horses, and they didn't seem all that interested in helping her get to town. She wanted to kick herself, but that would force her to find a way to contort very strangely, and she just wasn't up for that at the moment. When her driver's side door opened, she jumped. There was a cowboy standing outside her car. A very handsome cowboy at that. "Marry me," he said. His voice was deep and sexy, and she wanted very much to say yes, but she was sure there was someone running around with a net trying to catch him. Karoline blinked a couple of times. Was he for real? Forgive me, but I prefer to know a man's name before I entertain a marriage proposal from him. She was surprised to hear her voice sound so calm. Flustered didn't begin to describe how she was feeling at that moment. I'm Ted Cauldron. He stretched out an arm and pointed off into the distance, and she could see a large ranch house she hadn't noticed before. I live in that house, and my family owns and operates this horse ranch to your left. Marry me? He sounded so earnest, she couldn't quite get up the courage to say no. I never marry a man before the first date. So, you'll go out with me tonight? Ted stuck his hands in his pockets. Well, I just had dinner, so maybe not tonight. What's wrong with your car anyway? Karoline groaned. I don't want to tell you. He'd definitely take back his marriage proposal if she came across as scatterbrained. That's what she wanted though, right? He blinked a couple of times. How can I help you if you won't tell me what's wrong? She shrugged. I'm sure you'll figure out a way. He was obviously her slightly demented knight with his black cowboy hat. At least she thought he might be. Shouldn't his hat be white though? The whole situation was rather confusing. He grinned. What's your name and what brings you so close to Cauldron Valley? He'd noticed the Minnesota plates on her car, and he could only hope she was planning to stick around for a while. Wait, you're a Cauldron, you said? I've read about your family. You came here in the 1850s to settle near some friends of the family, and your family has been here ever since. And there's something weird about multiples in your family. She narrowed her eyes as she said the last part, wondering why there were so many instances of multiples in this family. She was there to study the area, but she wanted to concentrate on his family. Maybe she should humor him, but it wasn't her way. I don't think multiples are weird. I'm a triplet. Karoline shook her head. I want to interview you for my doctoral thesis, but this isn't the time or place. Do you happen to have a gas can? She asked. There was no way around telling him, so if she slipped it into the conversation casually, maybe he wouldn't notice. He grinned. Ran out of gas, huh? Apparently. She hated to admit it, but it was the truth, and he was going to find out soon enough that she was too scatterbrained to keep gas in her car. Well, I'll walk to the ranch and bring one back, or you can walk with me and meet my family. You'll need to know them for when we get married. I think most of the family should still be there. We do Sunday dinner every week, and today's Sunday. He was sure everyone was wondering where he'd wandered off to. She shrugged. I'll walk with you, but only if you promise not to introduce me as your future wife. On 5 minutes acquaintance, that would seem really strange. Oh, don't worry. I'd never do that. I'm the boring one, you see. Ted knew he shouldn't admit it, but she'd find out soon enough anyway. Boredom should have been his middle name instead of Bartholomew. The boring one? One of what? Karoline wasn't following his train of thought at all, but she didn't think there was a single thing boring about him. Why did he say that? He was much too sexy to be boring. He got her motor racing just by standing on the side of the road. Ted sighed. I told you I was a triplet, right? Well, my cousins are triplets too, and they're 5 days younger than we are. So, there are 6 of us, who were all raised as brothers when our parents died in a parachuting accident in Kenya. I'm the boring one of the 6. All of my brothers and cousins have amazing talents, and here I am boring as can be. I manage our horse ranch. She nodded, not really following him very well. Managing a horse ranch has to take some special talent. He shrugged. Not really. You'll see. He waited as she got her purse from her car, and the two of them headed in the direction of the big house. My grandparents raised us, but Grams died 2 years ago, so now we only have Pops. You're going to love Pops. I promise. He didn't usually chatter so much about his family to strangers, but she was going to marry him, so she needed to know it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm sure I will, she responded. Not that it mattered. She was there to study the town's inhabitants, not fall in love with them. Have you ever lived anywhere other than Cauldron Valley? She could start researching at that very moment and take her mind off the embarrassment of running out of gas. Again. Only for my college years. I went to Montana State, though, so it's not like I went to Alaska for school or anything. He had to come up with something he'd done that was exciting, so she could see he wasn't as boring as he must already seem to her. Have you been to Alaska? She asked, excitedly. I went a couple of years ago, when my grandmother retired from nursing. It was the most beautiful place in the world. We took a cruise and a land tour as well. We saw Denali and so many other beautiful places. We even got to go to the North Pole. Ted shook his head. Nope, never been to Alaska. I went to Yellowstone a couple of times when I was a kid. Ranchers don't get to travel a ton because there are always animals to see to. That makes sense. And you run a horse ranch? What exactly does that mean? She knew what a dude ranch was, and of course she knew about cattle ranching. She'd even heard of bison ranching. But a horse ranch? Weren't horses ranch workers and not the things that ranchers were raising? We breed horses. Our horses are the absolute best in all of the nation. My brother Bob is an amazing geneticist who chooses each sire and dam carefully. My cousin Kate makes a special feed for each animal that is now sold nationwide. My brother Jim talks to horses, and I know that sounds crazy, but he really does. They'll do anything for him. My cousin Deck is a leather worker, and he makes saddles that literally make the horses run faster. He shook his head. And I do the books. And propose to women who run out of gas on the highway outside your ranch. Karoline shook her head. If he was really boring, he wouldn't have jumped out of the box he'd pinned himself into and proposed to a stranger. Well, that too. He shrugged. I will say that you're the first, though. I don't usually propose to strangers. Or anyone else for that matter. You were my very first marriage proposal, and you turned me down flat. I may never recover from the experience. Well, it was my first marriage proposal too, and it was from a stranger. At least you knew what you were going to say. I was just shocked at the proposal. And I didn't turn you down. I was careful not to say no. I mean, I may answer you in a week or two and say yes. I'm reserving my right to do so. With her master's degree in psychology, Karoline found him absolutely fascinating. She wanted to analyze him every which way. Oh, I'm sure men fall all over themselves trying to marry you. You're special. You can't know that. Karoline protested. We met 10 minutes ago. Besides, if he thought he was boring, he should get to know her better. Her idea of an exciting weekend was reading self-help books. She had more issues than anyone else she knew. I can tell. I knew the second I saw your car I needed to propose, so I did. Ted knew it was strange, but it was the truth. How could he not propose when he'd just been thinking it would be great if he found a woman broken down on the side of the road near the ranch, an event that had never happened before? Are you a precog? You can see the future? She asked, intrigued. He would be even more fun to study if he was. Imagine what she could do with that. She'd never done much with paranormal psychology, but if she could put that twist on things, she could wow every professor she'd ever had. No, not really. I just get strange feelings about things. Why would you ask that? Why would you ask a stranger to marry you? She countered. You just finished telling me that your brother can talk to horses. How could I not wonder if you possibly thought you could tell the future? Ted frowned. I don't think I can. What Jim does is more like looking into their eyes and imagining what they're saying to him, and then they listen when he tells them to do something. I'm sure it's not something freaky or supernatural. Jim's as normal as day-old bread. Karoline nodded. Do you think perhaps he's normal, because you've always known him? You were womb mates. He laughed. I had 2 womb mates. I never thought to call them that. I like you, Betsy. Betsy? Well, when I asked your name you changed the subject, so I had to think of you as something. I kind of like Betsy. Karoline wasn't sure what to make of that. He was definitely odd and anything but boring. I'm Karoline. Karoline Deaton. Well, Karoline Deaton, this is where I live. Let's go meet Pops. He's going to love you. They were on the front porch of the house, and he had his hand on the doorknob. He couldn't have been more excited to introduce her to his family. Karoline hung back. Couldn't we just get the gas can? Absolutely not. My sister-in-law made some lemonade, and you have to try it. Are all of your brothers and siblings married? She asked. Both of my brothers are married and 2 of my cousins. I'm afraid Wyatt and I are the last men standing. And Wyatt had even put money on the fact that he wouldn't marry, so they all knew it wasn't going to happen for him. The man never lost a bet. So, what does Wyatt do around the ranch? He runs the horse track. Wyatt will bet anyone about anything, and he always wins. He's kind of scary. Karoline wrinkled her nose. A gambler? Yup. He opened the door and called out. Pops, I brought a girl I found on the side of the road. I asked her to marry me, but she hasn't said yes yet, and I promised not to introduce her as my future wife, so this is Karoline, the girl I want to be my future wife. Karoline felt like a bug in a glass with everyone staring at her. I'm seriously just a random woman who ran out of gas. I need to get a little so I can get into town. She wanted to kick Ted for introducing her that way, but she had a feeling it would do no good. Pops got to his feet and wandered over close to where Karoline and Ted were standing. What will you do in town? He asked. Ted leaned over and whispered to Karoline, That's Pops. I surmised as much, she mumbled back. I'm working on my doctoral thesis. I rented a house for the next year while I work on it. And I'll be teaching 2 online university classes while I work. The house wouldn't be open for a few days yet, and she'd need to live with her friend Misty, who was fixing up an old house to be a band B, But they didn't need all that information. They were strangers. Pops nodded. A smart woman is what my Ted needs. Welcome to the family. He spread his arms wide and pulled her in for a hug. I love all my new granddaughters, but today, I think you're the favorite. There was an annoyed sound from behind Pops. I'm your favorite, Pops. I brought you a new great-granddaughter. Now, Bobby, you know you're usually my favorite, but today, this pretty girl who is going to marry Ted needs to be my favorite. I have to give her a proper welcome into the family. I'm getting further and further from favorite by the minute. A girl shook her head, but walked over and offered her hand to Karoline. I'm Joy Cauldron. I'm married to Jim. Karoline nodded. Jim is one of Ted's brothers, right? Right. My best friend Tessa is married to Bob, and she's hiding around here somewhere. Another young woman appeared at Joy's side. I'm Tessa. Karoline smiled. It's nice to meet you. Since we'll soon be sisters-in-law, we need to sit down and get to know each other. Do you have a day free for lunch this week? Joy asked, a grin on her face. I don't know anyone yet, so I suppose I could spare one day for lunch. Well, I know my friend, Misty, who is renovating an old house to turn it into a bed and breakfast. Joy and Tessa exchanged a look. I don't know her, but that just means she's a future friend and not a friend yet, Tessa said. Karoline felt as if she'd walked into a play where everyone knew their roles and had been rehearsing for months except her. How was it that she'd met a man just minutes before, and he'd proposed, and now his family was acting like they were marrying any minute? She wasn't certain if she wanted to run or embrace the moment, because the cowboy in question was very hot. Insane, but hot. An older woman walked toward them, forcing her way through the throng of people surrounding Karoline. I'm so sorry for their lack of manners. I'm Griselda. Would you like some lemonade and maybe a cupcake? Karoline was afraid to say no. Sure. She wished she could look at her phone to see the time, but the darn thing was dead. Again. Does anyone have an iPhone charger? My phone died around the same time I ran out of gas. It's kismet, Griselda announced as she hurried off to get a cupcake and a glass of lemonade. When we had one cupcake left, I thought I might just eat it myself, but it felt smarter to save it. So, I did. And now I know why. It was for Karoline. Karoline reached for the lemonade and took a sip, her eyes widening. This is the best lemonade I've ever had in my entire life. Who made this? Tessa walked over and sat on one side of Karoline while Joy sat on the other. I made the lemonade, Tessa said. It's my favorite. It's wonderful. Karoline eyed the cupcake for a moment before taking a big bite, noting in the back of her mind that Ted had taken her phone and plugged it in, leaving it on the bar that led to the kitchen. And this cupcake is to die for. If everyone in this valley makes such wonderful tasting stuff, I'm going to be in trouble, because I'll have to buy all new clothes within a month. And that wasn't in the budget. She'd inherited some money from an elderly aunt upon her death, and the money was just enough to live on for a year if she was careful. And she could be very frugal. Joy laughed. Don't worry. You can eat whatever you want away from us Cauldrons. Karoline sighed. Well, I'm kind of a gym rat, so it doesn't bother me too much to eat naughty stuff. I just have to exercise a little more. That reminds me, is there a gym in town? She ran 3 days a week, but she liked to lift the other 3 days. It felt like the perfect balance to her. Why don't I take you there after you finish your cupcake and lemonade? Ted asked. It's a small one, where everyone just gets a key card, and we all go when we feel like it. It's a 24-hour thing. Oh, good. I lose track of my days and nights sometimes when I'm researching. I'm going to need to interview several groups of people here in town. Would any of you be willing to be interviewed for my thesis? Karoline figured if she was going to be on stage for these people, she'd make the most of it. Pops answered before anyone else could. We'd all love to be interviewed for your thesis. What's it about anyway? He asked. How living close to thermal activity changes a person's personality, whether they know it or not. I've heard this area has some odd superstitions, and I think that's part of it. Odd superstitions? Jim asked. Like what? Joy shook her head. Like thinking triplets are unlucky. Everyone thinks that, Bob protested. Only this valley, Tessa mumbled. Yes, Karoline. We'd all love to be interviewed. You should interview the women of the family first. We all can see how weird the superstitions are, and the men just think they're normal. Tessa shook her head. They make me a little crazy, to be honest with you. I don't know how the men have put up with them for so long. Sounds like interviewing you ladies first is the answer. Let's do that lunch on Thursday, if that works for you. We'll talk weird superstitions first. Joy nodded. I have a master's in counseling. I'm sure I could help point out some of the stranger people in town. Karoline rubbed her hands together. I can't wait to get started. Chapter 2. After she finished her lemonade and cupcake, Karoline thanked Griselda for the treats and retrieved her phone. I really do need to get into town to get settled for the night. Ted nodded. I've got a can of gas, and I'm going to follow you into town to make sure you make it safely. Besides, if he followed her, he'd have no doubt about where she was staying, and then she couldn't avoid him completely. Not that he'd stalk her. He wouldn't sink so low. No, but he wouldn't have a problem accidentally bumping into her in front of her house. Thank you. Karoline was a little wary of Ted, who everyone did seem to think was boring, but she knew better. The man was knocking her socks off, and she wasn't even wearing any. He was sexy in an earthy way, but she could tell he was smart as well. Just her kind of man. He drove her back to her car in a shiny red pickup truck. I thought ranchers' trucks were always supposed to be dirty, she said. His truck was absolutely immaculate. He either didn't drive his vehicle on the ranch, or he was fastidious about keeping it clean. Oh, they are, but remember, I'm the numbers guy. If I want to go somewhere on the ranch that's far, I typically grab a four-wheeler. Do you enjoy working with numbers? She asked. He nodded. I have a double major in accounting and math. I couldn't not take extra math as my electives, and I ended up with enough for a major in it. I know that's weird, but I've always enjoyed manipulating numbers. Oh, my. I barely made it through stats. Oh, stats is really fun. If you have any math to do for your thesis, I'm your man. Well, I'm your man anyway, because I intend to marry you. Ted didn't look at her as he announced he was marrying her, because he was trying to slowly chisel away at her resolve. How often are you going to say that to me? She asked. She'd never met a man whose focus was so singular. Ted shrugged. How often do I need to say it to convince you it's true? Karoline shook her head with a laugh. I have no idea, but I do know you're a little bit crazy, Ted Cauldron. It was a good thing for him she happened to be attracted to slightly crazy. Really crazy wasn't a place she was willing to go, but slightly crazy, well, she was all for that. He stopped at her car and got out to put the gas in for her. When he'd emptied the can, he sighed. I guess I have to follow you now. I'm not sure how I'm going to do without you beside me for the next 10 minutes. He deliberately made his voice sound like a lovesick character from a movie. It was fun to tease her. Have you been reading romance novels? Because the stuff you're spouting sounds very romance novel-y to me. Not that she had anything against romance novels. She thought Caroline Lee's historical Scottish romances were a hoot. Would I have a better chance with you if I read romance novels? He asked. Caroline shook her head. Nope. Not at all. Then I haven't been reading them, and I won't start. He shrugged. I'll follow you into town, stop at the gas station with you, and make sure you get to your destination. It's all part of the service, ma'am. He tipped his hat as he called her ma'am, and she giggled. The man was as far from boring as anyone she'd ever met. I think I like you, Ted. You're odd, but definitely interesting. With that, Karoline got into her car and headed for town. Her GPS was back up and working now that she had gas again. Ted got into his truck and smiled to himself. She found him interesting. It was the best compliment he'd ever received in his entire life, and he was already half in love with her, the only woman in all of Cauldron Valley who didn't think he was boring. His family always said there was something in the water there, and he hoped she wouldn't drink it. She needed to keep thinking he was fun and interesting. At the gas station in town, he pumped her gas for her, and paid for it. He wasn't about to let her pay for anything while he was around. He came from a well-to-do family, and with his tendency to always pick the right stock, he was worth a great deal more than any of his brothers or cousins. He just didn't really talk about it. After he'd finished with the gas, he leaned down to her window. I'm going to follow you. What's the address? Karoline looked at the address that was in her GPS 404 West Washington Street. Do you know where that is? He nodded. It's the big house on the corner of Washington and Elm. Are you living there? As far as he knew, the house had been run down for so long it was irreparable. He hoped she hadn't been conned into renting it sight unseen. No, my best friend, Misty, is renovating it and turning it into a B&B. She said there's a hot spring there, but no one in town will admit that it exists, which perplexes her. A hot spring? In Cauldron Valley? He asked, shaking his head. I'm sure I'd have heard about it. Karoline shrugged, having expected the answer. The people here really were odd, but she wasn't about to tell him that. Instead, she'd let him follow her to Misty's, and if Misty wanted to show him the hot spring, then she could. Driving through the streets, she stopped when her GPS told her to, and she got out of her car, immediately seeing Misty fly out of the house toward her. They'd been best friends since kindergarten, and though they had different dreams for themselves, it was a pure joy to be back together again. I missed you so much, Karoline told her, hugging her much taller friend who smelled of paint. You're later than you said. I was about to send out a search party. I ran out of gas, and my phone died at about the same time. Karoline jerked her thumb toward Ted. Ted Cauldron saved me from sitting on the side of the road forever. You said his name without licking your fingers and raising them to the sky, Misty said, frowning. Why would I do that? Karoline thought that sounded perfectly revolting. Okay, you're going to love this place. I think you know they believe triplets are unlucky around here? Misty asked. Well, yeah. That was what drew me to this place. Weird superstitions. Karoline couldn't wait to learn all she could about the whole town and all of their strange beliefs. You don't know the half of it. If someone passes by one of the Cauldron triplets, or even says one of their names, they're supposed to lick 2 fingers and raise them to the sky in a Hunger Games salute kind of thing. It's ridiculous, but you're the first person I've seen mention them without doing that. Misty shook her head. I almost want to do it for you, but I know where my hands have been, and it's not a pretty picture. Karoline rolled her eyes. If you have to do that when you see them, I can just imagine what you'd have to do if you kissed one. Are you thinking about kissing a cauldron? Misty asked, raising both eyebrows. I sure hope so, Ted said from behind Karoline, and she shook her head, trying hard not to blush. You weren't supposed to hear that, Ted. Karoline wasn't surprised he'd crept up behind her. He seemed to have a habit of being where she didn't expect him to be. Well, I did. And I think I need an answer to your friend's question. He looked at Misty. I'm Ted Cauldron, by the way. I haven't met you yet. Misty held her hand out to shake Ted's. I'm Misty Marsh. I plan on marrying your friend here, Misty Marsh, so don't listen to anything you hear about the cauldrons. This valley is very superstitious. Karoline shook her head. Thanks for following me here. She wanted him to go before he convinced even Misty they were about to get married. Karoline's mind was racing, and she needed time to really think without him clogging her brain with his sexiness. Wait, what about the kiss? She asked if you were thinking about kissing one of the cauldrons, and I had better be the cauldron you were thinking about kissing. Ted crossed his arms over his chest. Wyatt is the only unmarried cauldron other than Pop's, and he had run off, so you can't be thinking of kissing him. She sighed. I was taught never to kiss on the first date, and I haven't even dated you yet, Karoline told him. So, no kisses. But I asked you to marry me. Ted couldn't believe she was holding him to that antiquated rule when he was obviously in the relationship, imaginary or not, for the long haul. Karoline ignored the shocked sound Misty made. Go away, Ted. Not until you give me your phone number. I want to be able to call you and text you when I feel like it. She had never given her number to a guy she'd just met before, but she had a feeling she was about to make an exception. Ted was a guy she wanted to have her number. I might keep weird hours while I'm doing my research, so if I don't answer, please don't come knocking. If I do, will you be wearing something skimpy? He asked. He wanted to imagine her in skimpy clothes, but he had a feeling she'd notice if his jeans started to get tighter in certain areas. I'm not here for you to ogle. I'm here for educational purposes. Thank you for all your help, and for the cupcake and the lemonade, and for the new friends you introduced me to. I really appreciate all you did. She didn't want to sound ungrateful, because he really had saved her from a fate worse than death on the side of the road. He smiled. Good. I want to take you out tomorrow night. Karoline bit her lip. I will still be spending time with my best friend tomorrow night. How about Tuesday night? That works for me. She rattled off her phone number, and he punched it into his phone, calling her and hanging up so she'd have his number. There. Now you have my phone number, he told her. Text me or call anytime. As Karoline watched him walk back to his truck, she let out a breath of relief. I didn't think he was going to leave until I kissed him, she whispered to Misty. I could come back and kiss you, he called. I have the ears of a bat, by the way. She shook her head, not able to stop the grin from popping onto her lips. Bye, Ted. He made her laugh. How could she not be attracted to him with his boyish charm? He raised his hand in a wave and climbed behind the wheel of his truck. She was the woman God had made just for him. He knew it with everything inside him. Misty looked at Karoline with wide eyes. He proposed? Karoline nodded. Let's get inside before we say more. We do not want this overheard. She glanced over at the truck and saw that the window was still down. No way was she going to let him hear her talk about him again. But he proposed? Misty seemed incapable of moving from the spot she was in until Karoline answered her question. Before he said anything else. The man is bat crap crazy. Karoline shook her head, thinking about how life could use a little more crazy to keep things interesting. But sexy. He makes my knees weak. Misty smiled. Finally, a man who can distract you from your studies? I've been waiting for this my whole life. Me too, Karoline whispered, leading the way into the house. Asterisk. By Monday evening, Karoline and Misty had caught up on most of the past year. We do not get together often enough, Karoline said. I'm so excited that we're going to be living in the same town for a while. You rented the house around the corner, right? Misty asked. I did. It's going to be ready on Wednesday, so I'm going to be footloose and fancy-free until it's time to move in, and then the real work starts. Tell me again what you're researching, Misty said. I'm not sure I quite understand it. I'm studying the effect on the psyche of geothermal activity. This town is on a hotbed of volcanic activity, like Yellowstone is, and it seems most people don't move out of here. They live here generation after generation. I want to know how they're different from people in other parts of the country as a result. I can answer that, Misty said. They're weird. Karoline laughed. That's not terribly helpful. Thank you for telling me about this place, by the way. When I was trying to decide what to write my thesis on, and then you said you were starting a band B here, I knew I had to do it on this topic, just so we could live near each other. Besides, I'm terribly interested in the results of my study. I've missed you more than I can say. I mean, I'm glad I'd done what I did and apprenticed under so many different craftsmen so that I can renovate this house on my own, but I wish you could have done it with me, Misty said. And I wish you could have gone to college and grad school with me. Our lives took such different paths, but we're both doing what we love. Karoline shrugged, looking around the kitchen of the old house they were in. Where did you get this house anyway? It was left to me by some old godmother I never even knew existed. But it's perfect for what I've been wanting to do, so I'm doing it. I wish I could thank the woman, but I didn't even get her name. Just that she was my godmother. That's strange. Karoline shrugged. Well, whatever happened, it's perfect. Who has a house with 10 bedrooms? I love this place. It's going to be so amazing when you're done. I love it too. I'm going to put in a couple more bathrooms for 2 of the upstairs rooms, but then each room will have its own bath and everything. It's going to be perfect. That sounds really fun to me. I can't wait to see it when you're done. And this hot spring? What's going on with that? I mentioned it to Ted, and he denied it. Karoline wanted nothing more than to go out and soak in that hot spring, but she wasn't even sure if it was the right temperature. She figured Misty would offer if it was possible. I think they don't want this place to turn into a tourist destination, so they don't admit there are hot springs, but there really are. Misty stood up. There's an overgrown part of the backyard that I've been slowly clearing. The hot springs are back there. Put on a suit and we'll go soak. I'd love that. Are they supposed to be healing? Karoline asked, excited to give it a try. I have no idea. Seriously, I cannot find any reference to them existing or anything. The librarian told me I must be mistaken. Misty shook her head. The people in this town are truly unbelievable. You'll see what I mean soon. Well, I believe you. I'm going to go change and we'll see what we see. Karoline hurried up the stairs to the bedroom Misty had given her when she'd arrived. She changed into a one-piece bathing suit and then she went back down to see Misty in her own suit. Let's go do this thing. There are actually 2 hot pots that don't really exist, but they're fabulous. Temp in them is 104 Fahrenheit. I check the temp before I get in every time, in case it varies, but so far, it's always the same. Someone put a rock seat in there, so people obviously have known about it, but still, no one admits it. Misty shook her head as she picked up 2 towels and led the way through the jungle that was her backyard. I'm conquering the backyard a little at a time. Right now, I'm more worried about the inside. I want the house ready to open by October, but I don't even know if that's possible at this point. In the far back corner of the yard were 2 large pieces of plywood, and Misty removed 1 piece of wood. That looks like heaven in a little bowl in the ground. I know. It's amazing, but not really because it doesn't exist. I know it doesn't because everyone keeps telling me. Well, if it doesn't exist, then we don't need to share, Karoline said with a grin, climbing into the pot. As soon as she was sitting, she let out a little sigh of contentment. I'll get out in a year or 6. Misty laughed. It's really nice, isn't it? These things are going into all my advertising brochures. She leaned back against the rock back. Have you heard from Ted yet? Karoline shook her head. Not yet. He probably forgot me. She certainly hoped she was wrong, though. The man fascinated her in a way no other ever had. No way. I saw how he was looking at you. And how was that? Like you were a giant ice cream cone, and he'd been walking through the desert with no water for a week. Karoline laughed. Your imagination is in overdrive, my friend. She loved the analogy though. It made her hopeful that he really would call or text. No, it's not. I saw what I saw, and you can deny it all day, but it was there, and he's warm for your form. Oh well. Did you really just say that to me? What decade do you think we're living in? Isn't that what you said to me about Bill Fraser at senior prom? Misty asked. Karoline grinned. I didn't go to prom, but he was looking at you like he wanted your body when we took pictures before. I hated that you didn't go to prom. How was I supposed to have any fun there when you didn't go and double date with me? I was cramming for my calculus final. You know, math just about kills me and always has. Even then, Karoline had prioritized her education over anything else. She'd had no desire to go to prom without her mother there to help her get ready anyway. But prom? Misty shook her head. And Bill ended up being a moron who thought taking me to prom meant we'd end up in a hotel room later, and it didn't work out so well for him. Karoline laughed. I remember that. And he tried to start a rumor that you put out, and you told the whole school that he was an idiot. She shook her head. Good times. They'd both hated high school, but Misty had been determined to make the most out of their senior year. And you made an A in calculus if I remember right. Well, of course. But if I hadn't studied instead of going to prom, I'd have failed. Karoline knew that wasn't true, and she was well aware that Misty knew it too. She wouldn't have made an A though, and to Karoline that was akin to failing. That's not true at all. Misty sighed. Do you regret studying so much in high school and not having fun with the rest of us? Not one bit. All that studying got me scholarships, and I don't have student loan debt now. That had always been Karoline's way. She kept her eye on the prize. I don't either, but I don't exactly have your education. You should intimidate me, but since I remember when you spilled chocolate milk on your pants in kindergarten, and all the other kids made fun of you for wetting your pants, I can't bring myself to worry about it. Misty grinned at Karoline, who made a face. Why are you my best friend again? Because Buffy Ellingson had better things to do than hang around with you on the weekends, because she was training to be a model. Oh yeah. Buffy. Karoline had never had time for Buffy, and vice versa. I heard she just divorced her second husband. Misty shook her head. Every boy I ever wanted to date, Buffy dated instead. Now I just feel sorry for her. Yup. That's how it works. Buffy was the mean girl, and we're better for having known her. Karoline stood up. I'm getting too hot. Misty sighed. Me too. But now you know there really are hot springs. I never doubted you. Chapter 3. Tuesday morning, Karoline woke to a ding on her phone. She grumbled under her breath as she looked at the time and saw it was only 10. Who was up before 10 in the morning? She certainly wasn't. She wasn't teaching until the fall, but even then, she'd made sure her classes were scheduled for the afternoon. No one should be up before noon without a very good reason, and then they should rethink their priorities in life. Finally, after grumbling about mornings for a minute, she found the text that had woken her. Ted. It was her first text from him, and she'd started to think he'd forgotten all about her. I'll pick you up at 6 tonight. Be hungry. I'm thinking dinner and a movie. That work for you? By the way, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. Karoline couldn't help the smile that crossed her lips. The man could make her smile in the mornings. That was a little scary. Have you had your eyes checked lately? Don't need to. I know a beauty when I see her. I'll be ready at 6. Don't forget to practice your lines. If you can say the things you're texting with a straight face, maybe I will have to marry you. Don't think I won't hold you to that. And hold you to me. You tempt me like no other woman ever has. I'm no temptress, Ted. Let me be the judge of that. Karoline stared down at her phone, a smile on her lips. Ted Cauldron was something else. She put the phone down and stretched, climbing out of bed. Up before noon with no reason, but she knew she wouldn't be able to get back to sleep. His green eyes would haunt her forever. She changed from her pajamas into a pair of running shoes, shorts, and a t-shirt. It was running day, and she wanted to explore the whole town. She did a few stretches to get ready, and then wandered down toward the kitchen. Misty was one of those weird people who liked mornings. Often, she was awake before Karoline went to sleep. She could hear her friend's favorite music blaring as she painted one of the guest rooms. Karoline found a plate of bacon sitting beside the stove with a note on it. You'll need energy for your run. I figured you'd eat a whole plate of bacon first. So, I made it for you. Karoline sighed contentedly. Misty was her best friend for many reasons, not the least of which was that she understood Karoline completely. Misty knew her friend craved exercise as much as she craved foods that were fatty and high in calories. As Karoline stretched her legs out, she ate the bacon that had been provided. Then she filled her water bottle and tucked it in her pocket. She scrawled a response to the note. Thank you for the bacon. It's like you know me or something. Out for my run, but I'll be back for lunch. Maybe we can have more bacon then. With that, she opened the front door and began her run. She did a complete loop of the town, not sure how far she went and not caring as she ran, but she saw a great deal. There was a small church on the north end, and there was an elementary school she passed. She ran down a street that was literally covered with different food choices, and she knew where her meals would be coming from when she was living alone. Well, the meals she didn't beg Misty to cook for her. There was a Chinese place that looked a little sketchy, but the smells coming out of the pizza place had her promising herself she'd return there. Oh, the food she would discover in that place. She might have to add an extra mile to her daily run. Or 6. Maybe even 10. There was no telling how much she'd need. When she returned to the Band B, she felt like she had seen most of the little town, and she was thrilled. She hadn't seen any indication of any other geothermal activity, but she had no doubt it existed. She'd seen a subterranean map of the area that told her everything she needed to know. She did her finishing stretches out on the front lawn. She hadn't found the gym in town yet, but she wanted to start lifting the next day, so she'd have to do that soon. It couldn't be that hard, considering how small the town was. Even with moving this week, she didn't want to miss her workouts, because they were always so hard to get back to when she did miss them. When she walked into the house, she smelled the bacon Misty had made for her that morning, and she sighed contentedly. Walking into the kitchen, Karoline discovered she was wrong. Misty was making more bacon. Have I told you lately that I love you and plan on naming my first and second-born children after you? Karoline asked. Hey, if you marry a cauldron, you might have them both on the same day. Misty grinned over her shoulder. I'm making BLTs for lunch. On toast. How does that sound? Karoline nodded. Perfect. Skip the L and T for me, and add some American cheese, and I'll be a happy camper. Will it keep for 10 minutes while I shower? She checked her Apple Watch for the first time since setting out on her run. I did 6 miles. Not terrible, but if you keep making bacon for me, I'll have to up it to 10 or buy new clothes. Misty laughed. So, you want a bacon and cheese sandwich for lunch. Got it. And you don't need to worry about your figure. You're perfect. You just say that because you're my best friend. Karoline headed for the stairs. Oh, Ted is picking me up at 6 for dinner and a movie. Good. I think he's going to be the best thing in the world for you. Karoline didn't respond to that, not sure what to say. Her friend might be right. At the moment, nothing mattered more than showering the sweat off her body though. She was back in the kitchen 15 minutes later wearing jeans and a t-shirt. She wished her house was ready, but she was really enjoying staying with Misty as well. Having her friend close wasn't a treat she had often. Soon she'd have her own space, but still be able to visit whenever she wanted. Karoline sat down across from Misty and chomped into her sandwich. This is perfect. I don't know how you make everything taste so good. Misty laughed. It doesn't take a lot to fry up some bacon and toast some bread. I've had those skills mastered since I was about 6. I know. You were always a latchkey kid, having to do for yourself. I think you ate at my house as often as you ate at home in those days. Yeah. Misty's face got a faraway look, and Karoline knew they were both thinking about the same thing. Karoline's mom had been a second mother to Misty, and they'd both lost her when they were 16. She'd had breast cancer, and she just hadn't been able to conquer it. When was the last time you talked to your dad? Karoline shrugged. He was there for my graduation. Really? Misty asked. I didn't know that. Yeah. He and Angela were both there with their kiddos. Karoline's father had remarried when she was 18, and he and his new wife had 3 sons together. She often felt like he'd moved on from her when he'd remarried. No, it wasn't his intention, of course, but it was how things felt to her. She'd been particularly close to her mother, though. At least he came, Misty said softly. So, what are you and Ted doing tonight? Painting the town? He said dinner and a movie. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to dress up or not. Karoline was fundamentally opposed to dressing up when it wasn't absolutely necessary. She'd do it, but she wouldn't like it. The Cauldrons tend to live life in jeans and cowboy hats, so you can bet that he'll not be dressed up. Jeans would be fine. I hope he doesn't propose again tonight. I have to say, meeting a man and having him propose within seconds is kind of daunting. Karoline shook her head, thinking about it. Truthfully, she'd been very flattered, but it was still odd. Misty laughed. From what I hear, all the Cauldrons are getting married and doing it quick. A few months ago, not one of them was married. Now 4 are, and it looks like Ted has the woman he plans to marry within his sights. Karoline shook her head. I'm not marrying a man I met 2 days ago. Not this week anyway. She'd have to be absolutely crazy to do that. But maybe next week? You're attracted to him, aren't you? The man makes me hot under the collar for sure. He hasn't even kissed me yet, but his hand brushed against mine, and I was ready to throw myself on the ground and say, "Take me now." Of course, I thought better of it. Misty spit her water back into her glass, looking at her friend. Really? Karoline nodded emphatically. I've never really even dated, as you know, because I wasn't all that interested, but Ted Cauldron sure makes my libido stand up and take notice. I always hoped one day I'd meet a man that was more interesting to me than studying. Think he'd notice if I attacked him in a dark movie theater? Probably, but I don't think he'd fight you off. Misty carried her water to the sink and rinsed out her glass before refilling it. That family is like royalty around here, but everyone is half afraid of them. It's really weird if you ask me. Sounds weird. The whole licking your fingers thing is kind of gross if you ask me. Do people carry hand sanitizer in their pockets so they don't touch anyone with their licked fingers? Karoline shuddered just thinking about it. She did not want to shake hands with someone who had fingers that were freshly licked. Imagine how this town would react to a pandemic. I don't even want to, Karoline said. I'm having lunch with Tessa and Joy Thursday, and I'm going to interview them about the people around here. They're outsiders too, so their viewpoint will be invaluable. She seriously couldn't wait to get to know Ted's sisters-in-law. It would be interesting to see how they were reacting to living in Cauldron Valley. It will. I haven't met them yet, but people speak highly of them. But they think they're odd to marry the Cauldrons, of course. Well, sure. Because they're all so strange about them. Karoline shrugged. I'm not terribly worried about how people around here feel about the Cauldrons. As long as they don't lick their fingers when they see me coming. That's the thing, I think they might if you date Ted. Misty shrugged. These people are really superstitious. I don't know if it's like you think and the geothermal activity, or simply that they're weird, but you're going to find the people here very different than either of us are used to. Good. That's kind of what I'm looking for, Karoline said, taking the last bite of her sandwich. Lunch was delicious. And I loved how you left bacon out for me before my run this morning. I usually just eat some lunch meat or some cheese, but bacon, well, bacon should be its own food group. I would eat it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner if I could. And truthfully, I often do. Bacon was easily microwaved, which was the only form of cooking Karoline had mastered. She even had a special microwave bacon pan she liked to use. Misty sighed. I wish I could eat like you do and still look as slender as you. It's all the running. I'd rather run the calories away than not eat them. I mean seriously, why bother living if you can't eat what you want to eat when you want to eat it? Misty stood and carried her plate to the sink. I guess. Leave the dishes. I'll get them. I'm not starting to work for a couple of days yet, and I have time. You get back to painting. I love what you're doing with this place. Karoline could already see Misty's vision for the Band B, and she couldn't wait until it was finished to see if the vision matched the reality. Misty smiled. Thanks. And me too. Each room is going to be named after a pair of famous lovers. I can't wait until I can open and people will actually stay here. This is my dream come true. I know it is, and it's one you've had your whole life. I'm proud of you for doing what you needed to do to make it happen. Karoline had watched Misty take all the boys' classes in school. Woodworking, etc., and Karoline had been impressed with her friend as Misty had apprenticed under anyone who would take her. Now she had the skills to completely renovate a house with no help. It would be a ton of work, but Karoline knew Misty was up to the challenge. Misty could do anything. Karoline did the dishes, and then she spent a little time in her room, working on the questionnaire she'd use with people in town. She really couldn't wait to get into the meat of her subject and learn if she was right in her theories. But she had to get a large sample group, and she had no idea how the people there would respond to the idea of being interviewed. They wouldn't even admit that they had any hot springs. When it was time to get ready for her date with Ted, she considered pulling out the makeup she usually only wore when she had a presentation to give, and she decided against it. She was a little bit of lipstick kind of girl, and if he didn't like it, then he didn't like her. She wasn't about to change to become someone she wasn't for any man. The doorbell rang promptly at 6, and she rushed down the stairs to get the door. For a moment, she considered sliding down the banister, but she knew that would be the time she would crash and hurt herself. Her first date with Ted did not need to happen in the ER. Opening the door, she grinned at him, calling loudly, "I'm leaving, Misty. Don't wait up." Then she shut the door behind her. "Does that mean you're planning on staying out all night with me?" Ted asked, obviously liking the idea. "It means that Misty goes to bed by 9 most nights, and she shouldn't feel the need to wait up for me." She walked beside him out to his truck and was pleasantly surprised when he opened the door for her. Misty had been right, and he was wearing jeans, a button-up shirt and his black cowboy hat, so she was pleased she'd listened to her friend. "Where are you taking me for supper?" Karoline asked, excited to finally be going out with him. It seemed like they'd met forever ago, and they hadn't even been out on a date yet. It was definitely time in her eyes. "I figured we'd do steak." "You're not a vegetarian, are you?" "I'm a carnivore through and through," she told him. "I would eat bacon for every meal if I could get away with it." "Well, I can approve of that as a diet. We Cauldrons happen to be bacon lovers. I think we should all eat bacon for every meal." "What's wrong with that?" Karoline grinned at him. "Absolutely nothing. Misty actually had bacon waiting for me before my run this morning. It was glorious. And then we had BLTs for lunch, but I had her remove the L and T. No need to act like a bunny. She could go for bacon again, of course, because nothing was better than bacon." "No, there's really not." He pulled into a parking lot and unbuckled. "This is my favorite steak place. It's the only one in town, but it's better than places like it I've been to outside of town. And they have this appetizer that's shrimp, stuffed with cheese, and wrapped in bacon. I have a feeling we'll be eating that." Ted could already taste it, and if she loved bacon as much as she claimed to, then he couldn't wait to eat it with her. "I have a feeling I'd kill for that." Karoline grinned at Ted. "You need to realize, now, that I'm never going to pretend not to have an appetite just because I'm on a date." Ted nodded. "Good. I want you to be who you really are. You don't need to be fake." "I won't be. That's a promise." Walking into the restaurant together, Karoline noted that the person seating them immediately licked her fingers and raised them to the sky. "Hey, Ted. Good to see you," she said as she wound her way through the tables. "This good?" He nodded. "Perfect. Thanks, Tracy." "You bet. Barb's going to serve you." Then the woman wandered away. Karoline figured Ted knew who Barb was, so she didn't say anything, instead reading over her menu. This was definitely a small town with people greeting each other by their first names. A moment later, Barb was at the table, licking her fingers and raising them in the air. Karoline frowned. "You're going to wash your hand before you touch our food, aren't you?" Barb grinned. "Sure am. You'll get used to the licking if you're going to spend any real time with Ted here. I guess. And don't assume I'm going to spend a lot of time with him." Ted frowned. "I asked her to marry me, and she's making me wait for an answer." Karoline shook her head, rolling her eyes. "Only because I felt the need for at least a date before I agreed to a marriage proposal." Barb laughed. "No one ever thought you Cauldron boys would marry, and here you are, all falling one after the other. It's crazy." Ted latched onto Karoline's words, ignoring Barb's. "Does that mean you're giving me an answer tonight?" "I don't know. I guess we'll find out at the end of the night, won't we? Don't get your hopes up though." Karoline grinned at Barb, who laughed. "Good for you. Give him a hard time. He deserves it." Barb grinned at Ted. "What are the two of you drinking?" "Shirley Temple for me," Karoline said. "The sweeter the better." "All right. Ted?" "Pepsi. And we want some bacon shrimp bites." Barb smiled. "Good choice. They are the yummiest things on this side of the Rockies." "Well, then we're going to gobble them all up," Karoline said. She probably should have run an extra mile since she was having bacon for 3 meals that day, but she wasn't terribly worried about it. After Barb wandered off to put their appetizer order in, Karoline asked, "Would you drive me by the gym tonight? I need to get back to lifting tomorrow. I ran 6 miles this morning, but that won't be enough after having bacon for 3 meals today." Ted's eyes grew wide. "You had bacon for 3 meals? Really?" He knew she'd said something about bacon, but he hadn't realized it was really 3 meals in one day. She nodded. Bow to my greatness. He laughed. I'd have done it too, if I could have convinced Griselda to make it for me. I live at home with Pops and Griselda. We decided one of us should live with Pops after Grams died, and I was it. He had volunteered, actually, because he knew he and Pops would get along with the least amount of bickering. Pops rarely had anything to say about money, but he argued about each step in the ranching process. It made things easier on all of them. Is he getting senile? Oh, the man's been senile as long as I've known him. Nah, we just wanted someone watching over him after he lost the love of his life. They were married for over 60 years. That makes a lot of sense. And Ted just stepped up a full staircase in Karoline's eyes. Any man who would live with his grandfather to help him through the loss of his grandmother, well, he was a keeper. Chapter 4. By the time their food came out, Karoline was perfectly at ease with Ted. She ate her share of the bacon shrimp bites. These things are glorious. I'll have to run an extra mile or two tomorrow, but I will never regret putting them on my lips. My mom used to tell me, a minute on the lips, forever on the hips. So, I started working out, because I knew those things would always be on my lips. Ted laughed, shaking his head. I think you're perfect just the way you are. Well, the way I am consists of lifting for an hour 3 days a week and running for 2 hours 3 days a week. I take 1 day a week off to gorge myself, though, because there's no point in living otherwise. Agreed. I can help you think of more creative ways to work out if you want to marry me, he said, wiggling his eyebrows at her, so there would be no doubt about his meaning. She laughed. I suppose that might tempt me. I've heard that's more fun than running 6 miles anyway. I'd even run 6 miles with you if you'd marry me, he said. He wasn't a runner, but he'd become one, for her. Barb stopped at the edge of the table with drink refills. You have to accept that. Seriously, what kind of man would run with a woman to keep her happy? As soon as she set down the drinks, she licked her fingers and held them up. That was so sweet, I almost forgot to protect myself from the bad luck of the triplets. Were you born and raised here, Barb? Karoline asked. Barb nodded. Yup, went to school with all 6 Cauldron boys too. Interesting. The superstitions here are why I'm in town actually. Karoline asked. I'm studying the geothermal activity and how it affects people's core beliefs. I have no idea what that means, but it sounds like you do. We'll have to sit down sometime so I can tell you all the stories I have from when the Cauldron boys were in school. Oh, that would be lovely. Karoline was thrilled with how many people seemed to be willing to talk to her about growing up in Cauldron Valley. The people here were certainly open about some things. Do you know if there are any hot springs in town? No, there aren't. I wish there were, because I would soak in some. Would be nice. Barb's eyes didn't quite meet Karoline's when she answered that question. Interesting. Was the entire town trying to hide the existence of something that could put them on the map with tourists? Why do you keep asking about hot springs? Ted asked after the server had walked away. My friend Misty found some on her property, and they were obviously built up and well used, but every time she asks about them, people either deny them or get evasive. I can't figure out why. Ted shrugged. Maybe we like our town the way it is, and we're worried that if people find out we have a hot spring here, there will be tourists everywhere. He wasn't aware of hot springs, but his family was often left out of some of the things the town people all took for granted. It was strange how everyone set them apart. Is that what it is? She asked. No idea. There are no hot springs. He offered her a bite of his baked potato. Isn't that delicious? Karoline made a mental note to keep asking about the hot springs. Surely there was someone in town who would admit they existed. After their meal, they drove past the gym on their way to the theater in town. There it is. $25 a month, and you get a key card with unlimited access. I'm a member. Do you go? She asked. She would happily lift with him. It would be a fun hobby they could share. He shook his head. Nah. I get enough exercise when I help out around the ranch, but I really like to support local businesses. It's a small area, and it's hard to make a living here. Whether it's something I'll use or not, I try to always support. My family has always done that. I can understand that, she said. Well, if you ever feel like going in to lift or run on the treadmill like a hamster, let me know. She would start working on him and get him in there with her. How hard could it be? Do you run on the treadmill like a hamster? He asked. Only if it's snowing or raining. Sometimes not even then. I hate being inside when I run. I want to see the beauty of the world around me. I don't care how cold it gets, I'm usually outside for my runs. She shook her head. Why bother running otherwise? No idea, he said, grinning over at her. Our theater only shows one movie at a time, so there aren't any real choices. This one is a Disney movie. You mind? He didn't care what they saw as long as he got to sit beside her in the theater. Karoline shook her head. I go to the theater to see every Disney movie anyway. It'll save me a trip later. Oh. I was hoping you wouldn't like Disney movies, he said, seeming let down. Why is that? Ted grinned at her. Well, if you didn't like them, we could sit in the back row and make out. Karoline laughed. You're a mess, Ted Cauldron. That's okay. At least you're not finding me boring so far. You proposed within 3 seconds of meeting me. I will never find you boring. I promise. How could she? He always kept her guessing. Well, then you should agree to marry me. Don't you think that would be a good idea? She sighed. We haven't finished our first date yet. I think it's going to take a little longer for me to get to know you well enough to be able to make that decision. I don't eat popcorn with my mouth open at movies, he said. Ooh, very tempting. But not yet. I need to see that for myself. Karoline was finding it fun to always be joking around about his marriage proposal. She was pretty sure he hadn't meant it anyway. She had to resist rolling her eyes when the teenager, taking Ted's money for the tickets, licked his fingers and held them up first. Please don't give us anything with the hand you licked. What if there's a pandemic we don't know about? If it was the last thing she did, she would convince the people in this town that licking their fingers and touching others was not sanitary. The boy just shook his head and handed the change to Ted with the other hand. Enjoy the movie, he said automatically. Ted took the tickets, the popcorn, and his drink, leaving her to carry her own. You lead, he said. I'll sit wherever you want. What if I like the front row? She didn't really care much where she sat, but she knew most people weren't fond of the front row. Then I'll sit in the front row. There were only 10 or 15 people in the theater, and she chose a seat toward the middle. She took a seat 3 seats in from the row, so he could choose to sit right beside her or 1 seat away. When he sat in the chair next to hers, she smiled. That's what she'd wanted, but choices were always good. Don't be afraid to pig out on the popcorn, he whispered. We get unlimited free refills. Not that he wouldn't buy her more, but he knew from what she'd told him that she was always hungry. Though the meal they'd just eaten should have filled her up, he had a feeling it hadn't. Oh, I'm never afraid to pig out on anything, Karoline said, grinning at him. And where are the chocolate-covered raisins? Together, they ate through all the snacks during the previews, and Ted jumped up to get more popcorn. He was liking Karoline a little more with every minute he was able to spend with her, and he knew she was the right woman for him to spend his life with. He just wished he knew the right way to convince her. The boy behind the counter licked his fingers as he took the popcorn refill. "Your lady friend is weird," the boy said. "She didn't think I should lick my fingers." Ted nodded. "She's not from around here." "That makes sense. As soon as she finds out you're a triplet, she'll be licking her fingers like the rest of us." Ted wasn't so sure about that. None of his new in-laws were licking their fingers. Not a single one of them, and he liked it that way. He hated the finger-licking thing and had since kindergarten, when the teachers had showed the other kids how to do it. "The kid behind the counter thinks you're weird because you don't lick your fingers." He kept his voice down as he spoke to her. Karoline shook her head. "This is the weirdest place. Why do people here think triplets are unlucky? Isn't that just what everyone believes? One of those things like stepping on every crack on the sidewalk or your dad will have a heart attack?" he asked. She was taken aback for a moment before she shook her head. "Most people say, step on a crack, break your mother's back. Is that not how it is here?" What other superstitions had people in the area twisted over the years? He shook his head. "No, miss the crack, your daddy has a heart attack." "What are you doing?" She'd pulled out her phone and was rapidly tapping it, typing something. "I'm putting this into my notes." "That's so weird." Truly, Cauldron Valley felt like she was falling into another dimension. Ted shrugged. He thought saying your mother would break her back if you stepped on a crack was weird. Not the way he'd always learned it. So strange. He probably should have taken a class in superstitions in college. The movie started then, and he barely watched it. Instead, he watched the emotions play over her face as she concentrated on every detail of the movie. When it was all over, he was disappointed, because he couldn't watch her without her noticing any longer. As they walked to the car, he asked, "Did you like the movie?" She nodded. "I love Disney movies. I don't know why, but they just drag me into them, and I feel like I'm part of them. It was lovely. I'd go see that again with no problem. I'm glad that's what they were showing then." "Me too. Thanks for dinner and the movie. I really had a good time." Karoline was surprised she'd had so much fun. She'd figured that once she spent some real time with him, her attraction to him would pale. "I did too. We should do it again." "Tomorrow night?" She laughed and shook her head. "Tomorrow, I move into my own place, and I'm sure the whole day will be setting things up and moving furniture. I rented it furnished, so I hope it's mostly livable already." She was so ready to just get in there and make it a home. "Do you need some help?" he asked. He'd noticed just how full her car was the day it had run out of gas. She was startled that he'd offered. "I'd love help if you really don't mind." Having a strong back to help her would definitely make things a lot easier. Not at all. That way he'd know where she was living. "Why don't you meet me at Misty's tomorrow after work then?" She didn't really want to wait that long to get to work on it, but she figured she could get some done, and then he could help later. "Nah. I'll just take the day off. I've worked so many weekends without pay, it's not even funny." He figured it was time he took some days off and did what he wanted to do. Spending time with Karoline was right at the top of that list. He didn't care if he was helping her move or having a picnic. As long as they were together, he'd be happy. "Your family won't mind?" she asked. "Not at all. I'm the boss, remember?" He drove back to the Band B and parked the truck, turning to her in the vehicle. "What time do you want me here?" "Oh, I want to get started early." "Say 1? Then she could sleep until noon and still have breakfast before he arrived." "In the morning?" he asked, a little startled. "No, in the afternoon." "Who moves at 1 in the morning?" He frowned. "But, you said you wanted to start early." "1 is early. I don't usually wake up until noon." I'll have to set an alarm and everything. She hoped he wasn't an early riser, because that would definitely spell doom for their relationship before it even started. She'd never been able to understand people who were up at the crack of dawn for no apparent reason. I see. I guess you can set your own hours now, can't you? Yes, but I always made sure to take afternoon classes as well. When I took a morning class, I could never seem to remember to go to class. She grinned over at him. You look like you're trying to decide if you're going to kiss me or not. Is it a hard decision? His eyes widened and he shook his head. Not hard at all. I want to kiss you. She unbuckled her seatbelt and slid toward him on the seat, lifting her lips to his and kissing him instead of waiting for him to kiss her. She'd never been very good at waiting for anything, preferring to reach out and take what she wanted. His arms came around her, and he pulled her closer, his tongue reaching out to flick against her bottom lip. She moved closer to him, plastering herself against him. Was this what she'd been missing out on all those nights when she'd told guys no and stayed in her dorm room to study? Had she lost her mind? Karoline wanted to climb on his lap, to get closer to him. What was her problem? Slowly she pulled away, looking at him in the darkness, slightly out of breath. Are you a magician? A magician? Ted wasn't sure why she'd pulled away, and her question made him wonder what was going on. He wanted to bring her back to him and continue where they'd left off. No one has ever made me feel so much. I think I need to stay away from you. She either needed to stay away from him or live in his pocket. One of those. She wasn't sure how well she'd fit in his pocket, though. Or marry me. That's always an option. She laughed. Right. He caught both of her hands in his. Karoline, I know you think I'm being silly, but I'm serious. I want to marry you. I knew the moment I saw your car pulled over that I was supposed to marry the woman inside it. No, I'm not a precog, or whatever it is you asked me the other day. I just have gut feelings about things, and they always turn out right. Marry me. She stared at him for a moment. I don't believe in divorce. If I marry you, it's forever. Sounds perfect to me. How's Saturday? Griselda could put something together by then, and I know it's what I want. I don't know where you're moving, but I'll move there too. It was the perfect solution. I can't just jump into something like this so lightly. She pushed her long brown hair out of her face. Marriage is serious business when it's forever. People who marry right after meeting end up getting divorced. I want forever with you, Karoline. How could I not? Ted studied her face intently. Give me 24 hours to think about it. Karoline couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. She was going to think about marrying him? When had that happened? When he kissed you and you felt it from your head to your toes and all those secret places in between. She knew the voice in her head was right. He made her feel so much. How could she not think she should marry him? She certainly wasn't the type to sleep around, and he was offering her marriage and the whole shebang. Do you want kids? She asked. He shrugged. Pops wants us all to have a dozen. I'd be happy with 1 or 2, though. What if I don't want kids? Karoline didn't even know. She'd never thought about it. She'd been so focused on her education for so long that the idea of children was a little bit beyond her scope. Then we won't have any. All I really need in my life is you. You can't say that. You've only known me for 2 days. And already I can't imagine my life without you in it. I know your analytical mind has to be screaming that I'm insane, and truthfully, I'm surprised mine isn't screaming at me, but it's not. I know this is right. I don't have an analytical mind, Karoline said with a grin. All right. Meet me at 1 tomorrow, we'll do some moving, and we'll see what we see. She'd once had a teacher say that you couldn't tell if a marriage would work until you'd moved or put furniture together with one another. This would be the test she needed to know if he was the right man for her. "You're really thinking about marrying me, aren't you?" he asked, looking eager. "I'm thinking about it. I make no promises other than that, so don't get your hopes up." She moved toward him for one more kiss. "Oh, man. I don't think I'm going to ever be able to get your taste off my lips. I don't ever want to forget your taste." He opened his door, but she shook her head. "Don't walk me to the door. I need to start thinking." Karoline got out of his truck and raised her hand in a wave. All she could think about was Ted. His taste, his laugh, his green eyes. How had he come to mean so much so quickly? She was aware that he waited there until she went into the house, and she even respected him for it. Going into the house, she found Misty in the kitchen. "I told you not to wait up." She'd known her friend would though. She'd have done the same thing in Misty's shoes. Misty shrugged. "Like I was going to listen to that." "What happened?" "Well, he took me out for steak, and it was amazing. They have this shrimp, stuffed with cheese, and wrapped in bacon. I wanted to eat it for my meal, but it was just an appetizer that we shared. Anyway, then we went to see a movie. And then we kissed." Even she could tell that her voice sounded weird when she said the word kiss. Oh, what a kiss it had been. "Kissed? Tell me about this kiss. It changed my whole life. I didn't think my head would ever be turned by a man. Not until I had my doctorate anyway. And here I am, still feeling his lips against mine. Ugh. I sound like a romance novelist and not like a woman working on her doctorate." Misty chuckled. "Hey. I like romance novels. Smart women read and write romance, you know. I like romance too, but I'm not one of those girls who has her head swayed by the first man who kisses her. And now I'm sitting here wondering if I'm really going to marry him. I told him he'd have my answer in 24 hours. Karoline wished Misty would tell her that she'd lost her mind, but she knew better. Misty was more likely to encourage her than tell her to not get married so quickly. Misty grinned. "You're seriously thinking about it? You want to marry a cauldron? Will I need to lick my fingers when you walk toward me?" "You'd better not." Karoline made a face. "Every time someone did that all evening, I kept worrying they'd touch me with their licked fingers. The idea of that really grosses me out, and I've never been a germaphobe. Maybe I'll start wearing a mask everywhere I go and even gloves. Then people can't touch me with their licked fingers. What is this world coming to?" Misty shrugged. "I have no idea, but it's nice to see you so flustered. I remember when the cutest boy in school asked you to prom, and you told him you had to stay home and study. And now you're like this over finger-licking good Ted Cauldron. Oh, life is fun sometimes." Karoline wrinkled her nose. "I'm hitting the ice cream. Go to sleep. I need to be with my thoughts, and it's way past your bedtime." As Misty stood and headed for the stairs, she nodded. "Yeah, it is. I hope you'll remember that I'll be your maid of honor if you marry him. Go away, Misty." Karoline went to the freezer and found her chocolate marshmallow ice cream. She got a spoon and ate it right out of the carton. What else was she supposed to do when she knew Ted was waiting for her answer? Chapter 5. Karoline was certain that spending time away from Ted would put him out of her mind and make her realize that she didn't really want to marry him. Instead, she tossed and turned all night, thinking about him and what their lives could be together. She could imagine being pregnant and him bringing her a cold glass of milk. She didn't even like milk usually, but it was so refreshing in her mind. By the time her alarm went off at noon, she knew she had to give love a chance and marry the man. Though, she probably needed to make him sweat a little more as well. She couldn't let him think she'd always give in to whatever he wanted. She got dressed for the move in an old pair of shorts and a t-shirt that she'd worn to paint in at some point in time. If he didn't like the real her when he saw her, then she had no business marrying him anyway. He was there at 1 as she'd asked, and she had only the suitcase she'd taken into Misty's with her. Misty had declined her invitation to come and help, because Misty had wanted the two of them to have more time alone together. "Have you eaten yet?" Ted asked when she opened the door. She shook her head. "I haven't. I didn't sleep well, and I haven't been up long. Let's grab some lunch from Subway, and then we'll move you." "Subway? This little town has a Subway?" "There are more Subways in this country than there are McDonald's. I think every little town in the entire country has a Subway." She nodded. "Sounds good. Subway it is." Karoline started to lift her suitcase, but he took it for her, carrying it to his truck. She frowned. "I was going to take my car. It's packed with all my stuff." Ted frowned at her vehicle. "I'm not sure my legs will be able to fold up enough to fit in there." "I promise, they will. Come on." He'd better not be one of those men who didn't think they could let women drive them. She walked to her car and got into the driver's side, starting it up. When he got into the passenger side, she said, "See? There's even gas in it." "That's a good thing," he said, feeling like his knees were in his eye sockets. "How do I get to Subway?" she asked. She followed his directions, and they went in to order their food. She noticed that the fast food worker took off his gloves, licked his fingers and raised them, washed his hands, and put his gloves back on before he asked them what they wanted. Ted didn't even blink at the odd behavior, but Karoline felt like someone should do something about all the weirdos licking their fingers. She promised herself she was going to buy a few bottles of hand sanitizer for her purse. This town was downright creepy and full of germs. It was starting to make her skin crawl. They ate in the dining room there, and she made sure she sat watching the door. Every single person who walked in spotted Ted, and licked their fingers before going to place their order. Misty was right. The people there really were weird. Ted watched her as she kept making notes on her phone about something. Finally, he asked, "What are you doing?" "I'm making a note of every person who comes in here and licks their fingers before ordering food. Do you have any idea how many surfaces they've touched? Don't they know it's not a good idea to touch their faces in public places?" Ted chuckled. "You're going to love studying this town if you find that strange." "I do find it strange." Karoline shook her head. "All right, I'll stop making notes and start eating. Their steak and cheese sandwich makes me so happy. If only there was a little bacon on it." "Did you make it to the gym this morning?" he asked. She shook her head. "Never. Mornings are for birds and people who want to eat worms. Never for Karolines." "I see." Ted shrugged. "I usually work in the mornings." "Well, if those are your hours, then you can be forgiven for wanting to be up early, even though it bothers me. Who likes mornings?" Karoline couldn't imagine a single person in the entire world who would get up early by choice. It was just completely foreign to her. "I used to get up with my grandmother before anyone else in the family was awake. It was our time together. We'd talk about lots of different things while she cooked breakfast. Those are some of the best memories I have of her." "Did you never help cook?" Karoline asked, wanting to be sure she wasn't hooking up with some sort of chauvinist. "I always offered, and sometimes she'd let me. Usually she did it herself, though, because I slowed the process down, and when you need to feed 6 boys before they go to school, then you have to go quickly." He shrugged. "I always helped on the weekends though." "So, you cook?" Karoline was the worst cook ever, and more than that, she wasn't a happy cook. She preferred takeout or someone else cooking all the time. It was just her way. Ted nodded. "I do. I never get a chance, because Griselda shoos me out of her kitchen when I try to cook, but I can cook, and I enjoy it a great deal. I hate cooking, she told him. I'd rather do just about anything. Does that mean you want me to cook after we marry? He asked. Well, if I agree to marry you, and it's a big if, then yes, you'll be doing all the cooking. I'll wash dishes though. I don't mind doing that. I see. Well, it's a good thing Grams raised me to be a modern man who isn't afraid to roll up his sleeves and do the housework. I actually kind of enjoy it sometimes. Glad to hear it. She hid a yawn behind her hand. Sorry, my lack of sleep is catching up with me. She took a big bite of her sandwich and chewed it up before speaking again. We just need to unload my car. The house is supposed to have everything I need, including pots and pans, which is good because I don't have any. I do have a microwave pan for bacon, of course, because who could live without that? Not me. I usually do my bacon on the stove, though. Ted didn't care how his bacon was cooked as long as it was edible. He'd even take it burnt most of the time. I like it both ways, she said, grinning. She crumpled up the paper from her sandwich and took it to the trash. You ready? We need to get the moving done. I'm hoping I'll be able to work some tonight. Oh, I was hoping we could spend the evening together. No problem. I won't start working until 10 or so. That's my schedule. That's a rough schedule to keep. She shrugged. It works for me. I've always had noisy roommates, so I've done my serious studying after they've gone to bed. Now I'm ready to keep up my schedule that way. All right. Ted didn't like the idea of her working while he slept a whole lot, but it would work out. They were meant to be married, so he was sure they could make it work. They carried in box after box, and he noticed she'd labeled each one so he knew where to take them. The house was small, just 2 bedrooms, but it was all she'd need. And he knew he could share it with her. He'd be going to the ranch to work every day anyway. After everything was inside, she started going through boxes to put things away, and he sat in a chair and watched her work. She didn't seem to hesitate over anything, and she knew just where she wanted it all. Have you moved a lot? He finally asked. She nodded. Yeah, I really have. I never stayed in the same place for 2 semesters in a row when I was in college. No idea why, but it worked for me. So, I have an idea where I want everything no matter where I am. That makes a lot of sense. How did you meet your friend, Misty? Ted wanted to know as much about her as he could learn. Kindergarten. We lived 2 streets over from each other, and my mom started bringing her home with us after school. She was a latchkey kid. Her dad abandoned her mom when she was tiny. So, my mom kind of adopted her. Did you go to the same college? Misty did several apprenticeships instead of college. She wanted to learn how to do everything a contractor could do. She does plumbing, electricity, the whole 9 yards. So, we did different types of post-secondary education. She thought a lot of how Misty had chosen to learn. Her skills were a lot more practical than Karoline's were, and Karoline realized it. And you stayed friends through it all? Sure. We both read Anne of Green Gables when we were in junior high, and we decided we would always be bosom friends and kindred spirits. We talked every Sunday afternoon when I was away at school, and when she decided to move here, I did some research to see if the town would work for my doctorate, and since it did, I came here too. I hate when we don't live close. Kindred spirits, huh? Ted couldn't help but like her connection to her friend. She nodded emphatically. I'm sure you had friends who were like that. He shrugged. Not really. I mean, I had my brothers and my cousins, and we were all pretty much best friends. We were in the same grade, and we always hung out with each other. There was never a need for anyone else, if that makes sense. I made some real friends in college. Was different to be in a place where I wasn't just one of the Cauldron boys. It makes perfect sense. I'm glad you guys are so close. Karoline paused in putting a box of linens away. I'm excited to finally be here. I've been studying Cauldron Valley for 4 months. I'm glad you're here too. I've been studying you for 4 days. Ted winked at her as he said it. She laughed, walking over to him and plopping down on his lap. You know something, Ted Cauldron? She wrapped her arms around his neck and looked into his eyes. No, what? I think I'm going to marry you. Karoline watched his face carefully for his response, wanting to always remember this moment. It was something she would tell her grandkids about. A slow smile spread across Ted's face, and he gathered her closer. You mean it? Can we get married Saturday? Now that he had her agreement, he couldn't let her get away. Does it have to be this Saturday? Maybe I want to enjoy being engaged for a while. Do you? Karoline thought about it for a moment. No, I really don't think so. I mean, if I wanted to have sex before marriage, I'd probably be all for it, but I want to wait, but I don't want to wait, so this Saturday is probably good. Ted wasn't sure he'd followed her thought process very well, but that was fine. He wanted to marry her anyway. I'll let Griselda know she has the green light to get everything arranged. Does it have to be a big wedding? She asked, wrinkling her nose. If I have a big wedding, I have to invite my dad, and we're not close. Without my mom there, I don't want anything huge. Your mom won't come? He asked. He was surprised to realize they hadn't really discussed her family at all. If it's better to wait to fit her schedule, I'd be happy to do it. She died of breast cancer when I was 16. He sighed. I'm so sorry. I lost my grams to cancer as well, and losing her was the worst thing that's ever happened to me. Not losing your parents? She was surprised he wouldn't think losing his parents was the worst. She would have. He shook his head. I barely remember my parents. I remember Grams so well, and sometimes I can see her responding to things I say and do. It's as if she's still a part of my life every single day. I see. Yeah, that's how I am with Mom. I will do something I know she'd be proud of, and sometimes I'll even pick up the phone to call her, and then I remember she's not there. It's been 8 years, and I still can't believe she's gone. He pulled her closer to him. I wish I could make the pain go away. I will tell you that marrying me means you'll be part of a large rowdy family. I hope that you like big families. She shrugged. I never had any siblings or cousins. I just had Misty, who was mostly a sister. My dad remarried, and he has 3 sons now, but he seems to want me to not be a part of their lives. It's like I need to be completely separate from him and them. How do you feel about that? Ted couldn't imagine having siblings he wasn't close to. I don't even know. I guess I'll figure it out as I go, but I won't be inviting my dad. That works for me, I think. If you do decide you want a relationship with him, let me know. Where did you say you grew up? Twin Cities. I was raised in Burnsville, if you've heard of it. I haven't, but that doesn't matter. If you ever want to go visit, I'll go with you. Well, not until after September, but then I'm all yours. The ranch couldn't do without him until after September, but then he had some free time. What happens in September? She asked, surprised he was putting a limit on his offer. Moonbeam is due to have her babies. Karoline blinked at him a few times, feeling foolish for asking. Who is Moonbeam? He laughed. I forget you're not from around here. Moonbeam is our champion mare. We bred her to a champion, and we know her foals will be amazing horses, but they have to survive first. It's not really safe for a mare to have twins, and Moonbeam is pregnant with twins. Even with Cade making special feed for her, and Jim talking to her and asking after her needs, well, we still worry she's not going to make it or one of the foals will die. Those horses are the future of the ranch. You'll go broke without them? She asked, surprised. She didn't really care about his financial state, because she was a dirt poor student, but his family had seemed better off than that. Oh, no. Nothing that drastic, but we're counting on Moonbeam's bloodline to carry us through. Ted sighed. We have a lot invested in her and in her future offspring. She's been complaining of being too tired to keep going, and Jim keeps trying to talk to the foals, but so far, it hasn't worked. He's talked to newborn foals, and that was just fine, but not before their birth. Your brother is trying to talk to foals that aren't even born yet? Do you know how crazy that sounds? Karoline was sure the Cauldrons were all insane, but they were crazy in a good way. He chuckled. I'm well aware. But you know that the thermal whatever you call it is changing the people who live in this valley. I guess I do. Alright, so we're getting married Saturday. Do you care if I don't wear a wedding dress and just wear something I already have? The idea of having to go pick out a dress was nauseating. She didn't like shopping for clothes under the best of circumstances. If it wasn't for online shopping, she'd be wearing the same clothes she'd worn when she was 16. I don't care if you show up in what you're wearing now, as long as you show up. And there won't be a reception or anything, will there? She asked. Griselda will plan a reception. We can say it's just family if you want. Karoline pursed her lips, thinking about it, and kissed his cheek while they were all puckered up anyway. As long as we can say family plus Misty, I think that will be just fine. Misty sounds like she's the closest thing you have to family, so of course, you can invite her. Oh, good. Then I'm all for a just family kind of wedding. Small. I don't want a big lavish thing. Perfect. I'll let Griselda know, and she'll get started planning it. She'll play the piano if you don't mind. Griselda seemed lovely. She's counted as family, right? Karoline wasn't sure where they were drawing the line. Oh, absolutely. She moved in when Grams was dying, and she's taken over all of Grams's duties. I'm pretty sure she has a major crush on Pops, but he keeps denying it. How would you feel if Pops and Griselda got married? She asked. I'd love it. I think Pops deserves happiness. He and Grams were married for over 60 years, and now that she's gone, he should move on. I like that. Maybe that's how she should feel about her father remarrying, but it felt so different to her. Pops would still have all of his grandsons as part of his life. Her dad hadn't even invited her to the wedding. Karoline sighed. All right. I need to finish unpacking. I want to start working some tonight. I have the questionnaire ready, and I want to start interviewing people as soon as I can. Ted held her in place for a nice, long kiss that made her belly tingle in a way that convinced her being married to Ted was going to be exciting if nothing else. It was hard to believe the man thought himself boring. If you keep doing that, I'm not going to be able to get up, because you're turning my legs to mush. I like that idea, he whispered, kissing a trail along her jaw and to her neck. She tilted her head to one side to give him better access. Me too. A little too much. Suddenly she jumped to her feet. Okay, that's enough kissing. Time for unpacking. Just a couple more hours, and I'll be done. Call your people and tell them the wedding is on for Saturday. Let's make it after 4 though, so I can sleep a decent amount and still have time to get all prettied up for you. I think you're beautiful just how you are. You don't need to do anything special. Ted glanced at his phone, getting ready to call people who would need to be there. 4 is good? 4 is perfect. Karoline hurried through her unpacking, knowing that marrying would throw her a little off the schedule she'd set for herself. It didn't matter though. There was just something about Ted Cauldron that made her want to wear his wedding ring.